All right, next up we've got Mihnea Stoica. Hey, welcome.
Hey, good to be here. Thank you for having me.
So give us a little background on yourself.
Right, so I've been studying at the Breda University of Applied Sciences in Breda, the Netherlands, and I actually just recently graduated. And that's where I was kind of first introduced to Houdini in my first year there. And actually ended up spending my last year of university interning for SideFX. So I did my first half in LA with the games team, and my second half from home in Romania with the Toronto team. And that year I mostly spent working with the new KineFX toolset, and now I work as a character TD for SideFX.
Right on. So what's this presentation going to be about today?
So today we will look at mainly the new KineFX package, and to be more specific, we will go through the cleanup tools. So you have stuff like stabilize join, turn up adaptation, reverse foot, collect geometry. So sort of looking at after the retargeting or after the initial animation has been done, what can we do with it to make sure we polish it a bit further and get us closer to that final production result.
Excellent. Well, let's jump in.
All right. So our presentation for today is called KineFX Animation Cleanup Tools. And we're going to talk about a tool set for KineFX that can help with cleaning up some of the retargeting motion or even keyframe motion that we have. So as a short overview on what to expect from this tool set, we have here a walking animation of our character Eric, and we see there are a couple of issues with it. To visualize these problems a bit better, here is a zoomed version of our character Eric, and let's start and isolate each one by one. So here we see the clavicles are kind of sunken down, look unnatural. Here we see that we have some offset from the floor to the actual foot as he steps. And then also we've got some sliding going on. So these are all things that we want to address and that we hardly or usually cannot address in the retargeting process. This is the result after we've applied some of the cleanup steps that we're going to discuss today. So we see the sliding is gone, the offset is gone, and the clavicles look more natural. The toolset that we'll go over today consists of 5 nodes. We have 2 VOPs and 3 nodes. Let's kick it off with the first one, realistic shoulder VOP. So one scenario where you will want to use a node like this is when you have an animation that doesn't actually require the hands to lift too much, but it's just from the retarget directly we get this weird like downward look as we see in the overview. We don't like this. Using the realistic shoulder node, by limiting the clavicle downward rotation, we can get a much nicer and cleaner result. We like this. Next up, here is a version with an animation that actually has the hands go up over time. So here it's doing some weird shearing motion. And we see that the angle between the shoulder and the arm also looks kind of rough and unnatural. So we don't like this, and if we can correct it in the retargeting, perfect. But if we cannot, then the realistic shoulder will come in and help. So here we see this is exactly what we want. Now the clavicles follow the shoulders nicely, and it gives Eric a much more nicer animation. Now let's take an actual closer look at the node itself and see how we could set up something like that ourselves. So here we have a very complicated animation for Eric, where he's rotating his arm 90 degrees up. And we want to rotate his clavicle as well to make this look a bit better. So let's start by dropping down in the rig attrib VOP. Click on it and let's fire the Python state. Now we want to disable the output and we want to disable the second input. We only want to see what's in our main input. And while we're at it, let's also connect our deform pose in the second input, the same as our first example had. Now we can go inside and we can type realistic shoulder. This will drop us the VOP node, and we can start to look over the inputs and parameters. The first one is the file rest, which is already set to second input, so this is already done. The next 4 are some points that the node needs. So we have clavicle, shoulder, arm, and hand. So let's go ahead and start to grab these one by one. Clavicle, shoulder, lower arm, and hand. I'm holding shift to select all, and then I'm just dragging and dropping into the parameter view here, network view. So now if we get each point individually, we can plug them into the node. Perfect, that's done. Next up, we've got look at clavicle axis and look up clavicle axis. So what these are, rotation axis of the clavicle that basically tells the node how to rotate the clavicle to match the arm. So since we're in the state already, we can right click and display joint axes. And this shows us for the clavicle all three axes. The look at is the axis pointing at the shoulder joint. So in our case, it would be positive Z. And the look up is the one that's pointing towards the pole vector of the arm, which in our case would be that way. So the way the shoulder is supposed to, the elbow is supposed to be pointing at. So in our case, it's positive Y. Now, if we wanted to specify these, we can put down a constant node here, set this to a vector, and let's set our look at axis to be positive Z. You don't really have to specify them unless you get bad results, because they are both automatically computed inside. The same goes for the points. If you specify the clavicle point, the other three will be computed using a very simple heuristic method. So it's basically just looking at the parent of the clavicle and then the parent of that and the parent of that. But in scenarios like this one, where we've got a twist joint in between and their point number is in order, so we started, like if this were started at 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, this method won't really work, so we have to specify each one individually, but the axes will work, so lookup we don't need to specify. Next up, we've got rotation threshold, propagate rotation, hand pinning, limit clavicle downward, and active. To start at the bottom, active just tells the node whether or not to set the transforms on the joints or just output them here. So if you want to do something else with them later down, you don't have to actually set them in the realistic shoulder. Limit clavicle downward, as was shown in the first example, is basically matching the rotation of the clavicle to the one in the rest pose. For our example, we don't actually need this, so we can disable that. And then we've got rotation threshold, propagate rotation, and hand pinning. The hand pinning, let's go ahead and create a parameter for it so we can see it a bit better what it's doing. Plug that in. And then let's also make a parameter for propagate rotation as well, so we can visualize the results a bit better. Rotation threshold is the angle between the arm and the body, above which to start cranking up that clavicle rotation. So it's basically the threshold when that threshold is met. So when the angle gets over this rotation threshold value, the clavicle can start to rotate. And then the other two, so let's come outside here, we can exit the state. So we've got param2, which is our propagate rotation. So if we start to crank this, we see our clavicle starting to rotate. So this basically is a blend between don't rotate the clavicle at all and rotate the clavicle as much as possible, which is dependent on the rotation threshold. Usually somewhere 30%, 40% of the way there is something that looks quite well. And then for the hand pin, if we take a closer look at the hand, we see that it also gets shifted upwards. So the whole arm basically gets rotated around that clavicle upwards. But in certain scenarios, we might want to preserve the position of that hand to where it was in the original input. And for those occasions, we can blend in the hand pinning, which will now make sure to put the hand exactly where it was before we apply the realistic shoulder. So now if we check against the original input, we see that the hand doesn't move an inch. And this is the core of the realistic shoulder node. As a takeaway, the most important thing to remember here is you should always try, if you have data, so if you have data in the source animation that you're using for the clavicles, try and use that before looking at this node, because always using data that comes from our source usually will be better and cleaner than creating new data ourselves. This node basically generates data for the clavicle from scratch, so it should only be used when there's no real other way, or we can't use the data that we have. Moving on, let's talk about the reverse foot. So this node basically allows us to rotate the foot of our character around specific pivots. So we can do stuff like foot roll, pivots, foot lifts, etc. So let's take a look at the node itself. We have here a very basic setup where we actually got our character Eric. We're offsetting the knees so that we get a proper IK solve with no problems in the Riga trip VOP, and then a bone deform. So let's drop down our reverse foot node upstream of the rig pose. And let's start by filling in the required joints. So we're going to start by selecting the upper leg, knee, ankle, and then the ball joint. We have no toe joints, so leaving that field empty is going to be perfectly fine. Next up, let's also select the pelvis joint just to keep everything consistent. Now, once this is set up, we can display what we've got, and we can see we've got two little markers down at the bottom. Now, the two markers that we can see are the heel and the ball, because these are the only joints that we specify, so there's no toe joint. One way to position them properly would be to template our skin, come down to the toe here, and start to move them until we sort of get the position that we want. However, this can take quite some time, and there's a way simpler and faster method. So let's just go ahead and nuke that. What we can do is we can take the skin and the rest, plug them into the inputs, and that gives us the result already. It's basically projecting the markers onto the skin, and now we're getting exactly what we would expect. If we template this, we see they're nicely aligned at the heel, toe, ball, outer and inner. All right, now that's set up, let's quickly talk about the mode here. So we're currently set on create markers and solve reverse foot, which means we want to create the markers and also do the reverse foot setup in the same node. We can also just create the markers and then also only solve. The solve, of course, will not work unless you have some markers in the stream. We will get over the why we can sort of have different nodes or create and then solve in separate nodes when we talk about the stabilize join. For now, we're going to keep it to create markers and solve reverse foot. And now under the offset markers, roll and advanced here, we've got our options for actually using this node to give us the setup that we need. So if we look at the roll, we can start to see as we start to influence the parameter, we get this nice foot roll. Then under the advanced, we've got very specific controls for each marker. So let's zoom in here a bit. We've got heel lift, so lifting by the heel, ball lift, toe. We can pivot by the heel, by the ball, by the toe, and we can twist inwards or outwards. Another approach is to create our own set of custom markers and then solve those using the reverse foot VOP. This can be quite useful if the SOP does not give you the results you're looking for. So let's go ahead and create one custom marker for this example using the skeleton SOP. We can put the skeleton SOP down, enter the state. Let's come here and make one joint at Eric's heel. You can click over there. Let's name this heel marker R. Let's change this to modify and display all handle. If we go to side view, we can move it down a little bit and maybe a bit to the back as well. All right, so now we have our custom marker in the back of Eric's foot. We've got the rig pose as shown before, where we're just sort of offsetting the knees, and then we found the IK solve in the rig attrib VOP. Since we already have the rig attrib VOP set up for us, let's just go inside and add our reverse foot option here. So let's type reverse foot. That gives us the VOP. And at first it might look scary because there's so many inputs, but really all of those are just the same sort of inputs that the SOP takes. So we've got the joints that we're interested in, ankle, ball, toe, all the pivots that we can add, then some axes for the pivots that we can specify, and then last but not least, all of the options that we also have under the advanced tab and under the roll tab on the SOP. So for this example, we only have a single marker. So we don't really have to add all of those in. Grab this marker that we just created and bring it in the VOP. So if we can drag and drop, there it is. And now let's start plugging things into the node. So we've got ankle X form, which we can take from our VOP here. We've got the ball X form. Plug that there. There's no toe. And we have our heel pivot X form, like this. Axis wise, we can check if they are correct. So if we come to the state, We want the front axis, which should be supposed to be positive z, that's correct, and our side axis, which is supposed to be positive x, so this is not correct, so we can change this to be positive x. Next up, all of the other options, we can just make one parameter here, and we can connect this to our heel pivot, something that will work with the current marker that we set up. Once this is set up, we can go to the outputs and start to plug the outputs properly so that we can actually see the result. So we can take the ankle and connect this to the goal of the two-bone IK. So we're basically taking the foot, running it through the reverse foot, and then solving the IK. And we can also take the ball here and just set the ball on the first input. Once this is done, we can come out of the regatrip VOP, display Eric's skin again. And now if we start to mess with the parameter, we see we are getting the pivot. And this is the core of the reverse foot node. As a takeaway, this node can be used anywhere in our hierarchy. We can use it on a static character to create some animation using the options that we've got, or we can use it after a retarget step, then the markers will nicely follow the animation and give us access to some pivots that we can rotate the foot around to clean up the motion. Next up, let's talk about the stabilized joint. So here is an example where we've got some foot sliding. So basically what we've shown in the overview, and we already determined we don't really like this, we need to get rid of it. This is where the stabilized joint kicks in. We see here, we are basically we're using that node, and the sliding disappears. So let's take a look at the node itself. We have here a basic setup of Eric and a bad walking animation. We see the feet are completely not lined up with the surface, also offsetted a little, and floaty. So how we would go about fixing this? We have an IK setup where we just have a set of IK chains for the feet, a rig pose for the pelvis, which we might need to slightly push down to avoid any overstretching. And then here is a skeleton blend for the ball joints, because we will want to also add a bit of foot roll in the ball here using the stabilized joint, and the IK doesn't actually transfer the motion for the drivers back to the main input for other joints than the one selected in the chain. So let's start by dropping down a stabilized joint, plug the main target in, and this over there. And now let's select for our joint group, let's select the ankle joints. So we're going to select both of these, hit enter. So the node comes by default with the max position change option turned on, which will use an automatic computation of when to stabilize the selected joint. We see when the joint is red, it's being stabilized, and when it's green, it's not stabilized. However, we are dealing with a fairly short frame range here, so we want to go ahead and do this ourselves. Have a bit more control over the stabilization itself. Before we start stabilizing anything though, what I want to look at is this distance to geometry option, which kind of does the same idea, where it's just looking at the distance between the joint and the geometry, which, another note, is the geometry comes from the third input, and as we can see, ours is empty. If it's empty, it's going to use the grid world origin, so basically just the origin of the world, and with a normal of positive y, so the most default ground floor you can think of. Or we can just plug this in if we really wanted to, maybe give it a normal attribute as well, and that's going to be the same idea. So this. Right, so this is another automatic option for stabilizing the joints when it's within that distance. Now, we don't want to use any automatic options, as I just mentioned before. So let's set this to something real high, and then use distance to compute intersections only. This means that now we're not actually using that to lock the joints, we're only using that to compute intersections that will help us when we want to match the orientation. So down here, we've got the option for matching the orientation. We want to match before contact. So before we actually stabilize the joint, we want to start blending into that rotation of our surface. Orientation attribute is normal, if we just define it here. The custom joint axis, you might want to specify if the result you're getting from the automatic computation isn't right, but for Eric it's going to work just fine. And the direction, we can set this to -y because we only want to intersect in that direction. So now if you come back to the override section where we actually can start to stabilize it by hand, we're in the state, as we can see. So we can start with the right foot. We can select it, play through the timeline as well. And let's say we want at about like frame 1 to already start with it being locked. So we come here at the top, we can select both position and rotation to lock. Blend in and blend out frames, the default should be fine here. We can start the lock. And we see as we did that, the foot already snapped to match the orientation of our ground. And then we can go to about, let's say, frame 5 or something and end the lock. So now we've got, as we reach frame 5, we're going to start to blend out both position and orientation. Now we get a bit of a floating feet here, floating foot, because the I key chains is dragging it after. So let's lower the pelvis a little bit here. Something like this. So now we see we've got our foot nicely and stable. Let's repeat the process for the other one as well. So we can sort of come through here and look at when we want the foot to be planted. So let's say here, right click, start lock. That's going to lock it into place. Then we can move through the timeline. Now it can help us if we only want to visualize the stabilized joint. Here we see that we've got a guide geometry, basically, that shows us the original motion. So we can easy to decide when we want to release. So let's say roughly about here, we can end the lock. So then over a period of 2 frames, it's going to go back to where it was. Back to the skin, and we see we've got a nice step there, and then it blends out. And let's do one more. About here, start lock. And we want to lift it up, maybe here. Maybe we can come to our entries here, and if there's something we see we don't like, we can change it here directly. Or if we want, we can, for example, just go to frame 29 and lock, and that's going to also update the entries correctly. So something like this looks about right, as we make sure we don't get any floaty feet. And by making sure that the orientation matches, we see we've also got rid of any offsets. If, however, we still have some offsets, we can either just offset it using a rig pose downstream, or we can play with the enable snapping option, which will snap that joint exactly on the surface of the geometry. And we can do a bit of an offset to give us the right. Perfect. There we go. So now basically we've got 100% snapping onto the terrain. It's exactly where it should be, and it's also matching the orientation. Next up, let's go ahead and chain up another stabilized joint, just to try and get a bit of that foot roll happening. Because right now we see that the foot remains very straight, and it just sort of floats through the ground. So let's connect our inputs. Now, one thing to mention is that we want to also connect the motion clip. The motion clip output holds all of the modifications that we've done on the animation as well. So now both of our outputs hold modifications. But this node computes a motion clip inside to work on. And if you want to chain multiple, then just chaining the motion clip can save a bit of computation power. So let's chain up another one. Put the output there, and also make sure we have this set to our skeleton blend here. And now we want to set the joint group to be the ball joints. Select both of them. We don't want any automatic either. What we want to do now, we want to lock the rotation of the ball joint right when the foot lifts. So we get a bit of a foot roll type of thing. So let's fire the state. And we can go through this. Now we see that the ball starts in a kind of a weird position up here, as in it starts to sort of go down, and it seems like we're locking the ankle here, but the ball doesn't actually do anything, just sort of minds its own business. what we can do is we can come back to our ankle stabilization and we can update children transforms. And this will make sure that all the children of the stabilized node also gets stabilized and inherit the stabilization from the parent. So now we have it nice and clean. So we can come up here and set this to rotation only. Select our ball, and let's say here we want to start the lock. 1, 2 frames perhaps. Maybe here we want to end the lock, or maybe one before, something like this. So now we have a step. This remains, does not rotate, so sort of gives us a foot lift, and then it blends out of it. Let's do the same for the other one. Want to lock here and unlock roughly maybe one before, something like this. Now you see it already starts to sort of come up fairly soon, so maybe we can play a bit with when this gets released. So let's set this to like 18 and maybe lower the pelvis a little. So we have two stabilized joints chained up together, which sort of cleans up the original motion, gives us a nice flat foot on the ground, also a bit of a foot lift in the mix, and it's all of a sudden it starts to look a lot better. Now, this method of giving us a semi-decent foot roll is acceptable, but it's obviously not going to produce super incredible results. As we see here, we've got a bit of a movement in the ball there, plus it's sort of it's okay, but depending on your shot you might want a bit more options. We're going to take a look at a better way to achieve this kind of thing in the next slides. So in this example here, we see that if we play the motion, we get a smoother and better result overall for the feet. So if we zoom in a bit here, we see as the foot lifts off the ground, we sort of get this nice foot lift that's way more stable than what we had before. We have no floating feet, no floating toes, no anything. A bit of protrusion here from the way the animation was set, but this is easily fixable with a rig pose if necessary. And really it's more about experimenting with the combination of stabilized joint and reverse foot, because the reverse foot gives you access to a couple of markers that you can then use to stabilize or rotate the ankle around. So this can allows us to do some interesting things. So let's break down this example really quickly. The first stabilized joint is nothing too special. It's the same as we did before, where we just stabilize the ankle. Then we are building the markers for a reverse foot setup for the two legs. And then the next stabilized joint, what it's doing is it stabilizes the position and rotation of the toe markers. And the reason for this, if we do this, is because we want to avoid exactly this type of behavior, where the rotation of the ankle makes the toes kind of go downwards into the ground. So if we do this, we see that now we're getting this nice foot lift right here. And then the last stabilized joint that we have here is acting on the ball marker. So if we fire a state on that marker right there in the middle, and its purpose is to basically limit the extension of the leg. So we can see it better here. If we disable this, we see as we get this nice foot lift, this kind of deforms a bit because we don't really get proper orientations to match for what we've just planted. But if we also make sure we lock the ball, we get a nicer and cleaner result because the ball also gets like stuck to the ground, and then we get the lift off right here. And all the way at the end, we just have another reverse foot set to solve, to basically calculate everything that we're doing to the markers and put it back onto the main foot joints. And that's it basically. So playing with the combination of reverse foot, markers, and stabilized joint or rig pose to rotate them around can lead to some quite powerful results, even if your source motion doesn't have any like toe rotations or so on and so forth. As a takeaway, using the stabilized joint to plant the feet or any other joint really can be really powerful, especially after a retargeting that can lead to some slidings. But also using the stabilized joint in combination with the reverse foot gives us access to a much more powerful foot plant, because all of a sudden we now have access to all the markers generated by the reverse foot, and we can plant each marker separately. Next up, let's talk about the adapt to terrain. So this node is some sort of one foot into the area of cleanup and the rest of the body in the area of producing new animation roughly, or giving you a good pace at that. Here we have a simple walk animation for Eric that we also see in the overview. And now we want to take that animation and adapt it to such a terrain that we see here. So this node comes into play to basically generate this new motion for us. So let's take a look at the node itself. We have here a simple example of our character Eric and a simple walking animation. We see that it's a flat walk, and then we have a slope here that we would like our character to climb on. So let's start by dropping down the adapt to terrain node, plug in the proper input, and now let's take a look at the parameter interface. So the most important part to set this up is to come here under main and add in the hip or hips if you have a quadruped. So we can select the pelvis. And then for the lower limbs, we want both feet. So we can do knee, ankle, and then the toe. And then let's do one more. Knee, ankle, and toe. All right. And now already, if we start to play this, we see absolutely nothing is happening. And the reason for this is because our terrain input is empty. So if we actually connect our terrain to the terrain input, and now we play this, we see we are getting something. After in the initial setup, we still have a couple of options that we can play with. So if we come here to the advanced tab, we see there are a few toggles that we can play with. So the first one would be the hip lean range. If we enable this, as we start to play again, we see that Eric now is sort of bending forwards as he's climbing the slope, which gives him a bit more of a natural look while on the angled surface. Now, a small issue would be that we see that the way it transitions from one to the other, so from the straight spine to the bent over spine, it's kind of sudden. So to fix that, we can check max rotation per frame, and that will limit how much the spine can rotate, or the pelvis can rotate to 2 degrees. So now if we play, we see we get a bit more of a blend in to the rotation. Now to the leg options, we have the enable ankle to toe look at enabled by default. So what that's going to do is it's going to make sure that the ankle rotates to match where the toe is being projected. So if we disable this, we see that we are getting kind of a weird step. So we still keep our flat step, but if we enable this, we still will get a more natural looking step on the surface here. Something to note is that if your axis, that's the angle axis that's pointing at the toe, doesn't get computed correctly, we can come back here to the main tab and change our axis to something else. We can do so for each lower limb. And then another option that I want to look at is the enable terrain-based foot lift. So this option, if we just sort of quickly read the help card, enable lifting the feet based on the terrain slope. So we see that right now the step comes fairly close to the slope itself, because it's still using the same way. We're still using the data that we have, which is a flat walk. And this, in certain scenarios like this one, can look a bit weird. We want the foot to go a bit higher, so the arc a bit higher when he steps uphill. So if we enable this, we see we get an error, and we have here a position stabilization attribute, p stabilize data, which we don't have, so that's what the error is there for. And to get that attribute, we can use the stabilize joint node. So if we plug this upstream, give it a sec, there we go. Let's come here to the joint group and select our ankle joints. And leaving this to automatic, so max position change will provide a good enough result for our scenario right here. And we want to set this to output stabilization attributes. And then we can also connect a motion clip if we want to. So one by one, the stabilized joints will now basically plant the feet, and if you output that attribute, we see here p stabilized data, we're basically converting the idea of foot pinning or foot plant to an attribute. That's in, if we look at our geometry spreadsheet, here we see that here, for example, it's blending into 1, so now it's planted, and then it's blending out back to 0, so now it's loose again. So this is the data that the adaptive terrain is going to use to determine where each step is, so that it knows that the in-between arc needs to be lifted. And then the motion clip input we're just adding in for convenience, so don't have to generate any one inside the adaptive terrain. So now if we display this node again, we see the error disappears. And if we play through, we see we get this nice foot lift. From here, goes up and down. Whereas before, we had something like this. And we can change the blend if we want to lift it higher or lower. All right. Now that we're done with the Advanced tab, we can go over to the Solve tab. And this tab is fairly important because it basically just connects to a full body IK inside the adaptive terrain. And messing with these attributes here will improve a little the solve itself. So let's crank the iterations up to 100. Let's crank the damping as well to sort of get rid of that leg over extension pop there. And now we see we get something that looks very sensible. For configurations, if we need any, we can add them here. The default configurations basically set the feet to something quite high, the pelvis to 1, and also it's going to limit the rotation on the knees to only be in the correct leg plane. For our example though, we see that we don't really get what we're looking for, mainly because something quite high on the feet will make the character jitter a bit, since it's already kind of a stretch. So we can kill both of these, and this as well, and just leave the knee rotation. And that will give us a nice result. One last note is that if we don't want to solve here, so if we disable the solve, this will basically bypass the actual full body IK inside. And what this allows us to do is it gives us access to motion trails here. Ignore the craziness that's happening here, is because we don't have terrain. So this represents our pelvis and ankles and toes, and the way they have been rayed down to the terrain. So now we can basically use these if we want outside of the node, manipulate them even further. So we can do something like a soft transform perhaps. Can select a point here, increase the weight a bit, and lift that up there. So now we have this on the pelvis. We can move this a bit down. And now if we drop down a full body IK, we drop that here. And then we want to turn these motion trails into something time dependent, so that we can also like plug into the drivers of the full body IK. The way we can do that is either we can take the motion clip from upstream from here and do a motion clip update to update that motion clip and then motion clip evaluate. Or we can just put down a blast node like this. And here under group, we can set it to points. So the expression we want to add here is at time equals time being an attribute that we can find on each point of the motion trail. So it's basically storing the time dependency as an attribute in that motion trail. This equals our current frame minus 1, because we're dealing with time, divided by the current frame range of our scene. Now if we delete non-selected, we see we've got the time dependent back in the game. And we can plug this to the full body IK here, set this to match by attribute name, and then bone deform it. And now we can play with our soft transform as we see fit. And as we play the motion, we see we're getting the results. So this can be a nice way to take what the adaptive terrain is giving us, refine it further using the subtools, and then solve ourselves a bit later on using a full body IK. And of course here we can configure iterations, so on and so forth, to match what we had before. And this is the core of the adapt to terrain node. As a takeaway, keep in mind that this node should be used mainly as a base, because what the node's doing is it's taking an animation and it's trying to array that or produce a new animation from the base one. Usually if we, for example, walk on a flat surface, our walk will be quite a lot different than if you want to walk uphill. So this node is supposed to give you a solid base in terms of locomotion and initial arraying that can get you started into cleaning it up further and refine it so you can get to the actual desired result. And last but not least, the collide geometry VOP. So let's take a look at the node itself. We have here our character Eric between two walls, and he's about to be squashed, and we want to collide his hands with the wall, so as the wall approaches, he basically like pushes against the wall a little. So the setup we have prepared here is a simple IK change setup for the hands, as well as offsetting the elbows to improve the solve quality. And we want to collide the hands. So let's go ahead and drop down the regachip VOP, fire the state. We want to disable the output, go in, and let's get both hand joints, bring them inside here. You can start with the right one. And then we want to do the collide geometry VOP, drop it down, and let's also do the set point transform and connect these three together so we have everything prepared. Now looking at the collide geometry VOP, the first thing that we can see is that we need a geometry file, so we need to point at the actual geometry that we're about to use. We can do an operator path, or we can also just put into an input. Now this will throw an error because the regachip VOP computes the transforms for all the inputs, and of course our walls are not related to KineFX skeletons in any way, so we have to disable the transforms from the second input, and that's going to bring everything back to working. Now let's select this to the second input. The type can be primitives or points. We are good with primitives for now. The attribute is normal, we have normals. The direction for our right hand is going to be -x. If we leave everything at 0, that means all axes, which in this case won't make a difference, but this is just for convenience sake. And then let's also match orientation. We want to match before contact, and for the joint axis to orient, so basically which axis of the hand joint we want to orient to the normal of the surface. If everything's zeroed out, it's going to be automatically computed. But for this example, we need to tweak it a little bit to get exactly the result that we're looking for. So I have some numbers here. Now if we come outside and we check the result, we have a nice collision with the hand. Let's go ahead and do the same for the left hand as well. So plug in the X form, bring in the set point transforms here, this, and then this. Also make sure we set this to be positive X now. And now if we play, we see Eric pushing against the wall as the ball approaches. And this is the core of the collide geo node. As a takeaway, the collide geometry VOP can be used real time. So we can have a rig pose upstream with the collide geometry downstream, and we can, in the viewport directly, play with it and see how it influences our result. Another little trick that you can do is you can also try to use this on the skeleton and have it collide with the skin of the character, and this way avoid any intersections that might result from your retargeting. Thank you very much for your attention. If there are any questions or you have any issues, don't hesitate to shoot me an email. Cheers.